whenever I do an interview for television or radio or newspaper, a question often comes up, and what the premise to the question is Norwegians in general can't understand this American affection for firearms, right? So I think it's important first to frame the conversation in that a lot of the confusion comes from, especially in Europe, they look at the United States and say, oh, it's common sense gun reform, right? This is something, you don't need these weapons, which is particularly interesting from a Norwegian perspective, but I will get back to that. So first, it should be clear that, and you guys probably or might all know this, but the Second Amendment, or the right to own firearms, that is not something that's meant for sport or hunting or any type of recreation or competition shooting or target practice. It's not meant for these activities. Those are byproducts of that right. The right exists because first of all, it's a natural born right, right? It's not framed in the way that the Constitution itself is what gives us this right. It's the Constitution that reaffirms the right that we're born with, because there is this firmly held belief, at least in the United States, that we have a natural born right to equalized self-defense. And a firearm is our last resort for that equalized self-defense. Meaning, defense against trespass and tyranny, right? So yes, against self-defense against my fellow man who may trespass on my property or on my family or in these types of scenarios, but also against a potentially tyrannical government. It is the duty of every citizen to always question their government, to always stand up to their government, and never to have this conformist mentality that just kind of gives the government the benefit of the doubt and hopes for the best, right? And so first, that's the root of the Second Amendment, and that's really important to understand the differences in worldviews, particularly in Europe, but also amongst Americans between leftists and conservatives or classical liberals, in the sense that leftists, for example, they too are American citizens and they too have this right? But the disagreement comes from who has that moral authority to dictate over me. Right. So the Democrats, of course, advocate for more of a democracy sense, mob rule, right? As long as they can get 51% of the people to say, and they can. That's why they love to cite polls so often. Oh, it's this percentage of people that say this or that. 51% of Americans, it's not 51%, but you know whatever the percentage is, say that the Americans say that they want more gun control, right? Well, that's a very vague question. Do you want more gun control? Well, yeah, I want more gun control. But the second you start talking to an American and break down what gun control actually means, those statistics plummet. They drop through the floor. Because Americans in general, especially, I mean, most Americans are generally moderate. They lean one way or they lean the other because they got shit to do during the day and they're not as obsessed with politics as the talking heads and political science students are. And if you do a poll, it doesn't matter left or right. The vast majority of Americans favor and treasure their right to own a firearm. And leftists know this. And the second it ever gets to the point of actually discussing a firearms ban of any kind, especially for let's say the AR-15, for example, which is only cosmetically different from a hunting rifle. It's not functionally really that different from a hunting rifle that has a wooden stock, for example. It looks scary. As they say, we want to ban assault rifles or assault weapons. Okay, what's an assault weapon? Tell me what an assault weapon is. And they can never answer that question because it comes down to cosmetic fear, superficial fear, but not have any actual understanding of how the weapon functions itself. So they go about this very delicately, because if it ever get to that point of banning a weapon, there would be a lot of heated debate and a lot of argument, but the second authorities start showing up the doors of Americans to collect weapons, that's when the United States devolves into a very bloody civil war. And the ones who have guns are the ones that are going to win that war. So it's a very delicate ecosystem when it comes to this debate, and right now people are just emotionally charged and very angry, and as they should be. It's very sad when a school shooting like Parkland happens, but the debate has been going in the wrong direction between between leftists and those in the Republican Party, or it doesn't have to be the Republican Party, those who believe in the right to own a firearm, because we aren't disagreeing that it's sad that the kids died, and we aren't disagreeing that we want to find a solution to make sure this never happens again. Where we're disagreeing is what the source of this problem actually was. I don't believe it's the gun's fault, right? I don't believe the gun woke up one morning and decided he's going to go into the school and start shooting. I think it's more interesting for me to look at this from a cultural from a cultural perspective. You look at the vast majority of mass shooters in recent history. Almost all of them grew up in single mother households with no father around to raise them, and a large portion of them are also on some kind of psychotic drug, some kind of pharmaceutical prescription drug. So I think these are more interesting commonalities to evaluate between them and wonder how has the changes in the family structure over the last couple of decades, how has that affected kids like these who are making these decisions? But what's even more interesting is to look at really when the media, they overplay this violence, they overplay this mass shooting thing. The fact is crime peaked in the early 1990s in the United States. That's when it was at its all-time highest, was the 1990s. Since that point in time, crime has been steadily decreasing, and at this point, in this, let's say, 3-year window, we're at the lowest point in violent crime all around, gun crime included, in almost half a century. And that has just been going down. In that same period of time, the amount of firearms in civilian possession in the United States has almost, not quite, but almost doubled. Right? Under Obama, it got to the point where there's at least one firearm for every citizen in the United States, one firearm for every man, woman, and child in America. Right? So here, if you look at this, you have crime, without a doubt, that has been steadily declining, almost half a century low at this point, and firearms that have been steadily decreasing. So what that tells us is there's no correlation between firearms ownership and gun crime, firearm ownership and gun-related murders, for example. Then you can take that down even further and look at, they often say, well, look at all these gun deaths, and it's usually some really high number. Well, what they rarely do is ever tell you that about 2/3 of those gun deaths are actually suicides. They're not murders, they're suicides. Then, when you look at where these murders are happening, it's about 2/3 of murders in the United States are happening in about 5% of all U.S. counties, FILCAs. Right? All 5%, just 5, that tells us that there's a heavy concentration of murder in some places, and it's not anywhere near as common in others. Now, in these, and then another interesting study that was done and actually published by the Washington Post, which is a very left-leaning publication, would show that less than 20% of firearm-related crime are committed by those who do not legally own the firearm. Okay? So all of these facts and figures, it tells a lot more, it paints a lot more of an accurate picture than what the sensationalism in media tries to paint for us. Right? Then if we look at the scary AR-15, right? You look in every newspaper in the United States and everybody's saying, oh, we need to ban the AR-15. We need to ban this scary assault weapon. We need to ban this semi-automatic rifle. Some of them call it a fully semi-automatic rifle, which is quite interesting. And then again, it just attests to their ignorance. But if you look at the actual numbers of how many people are killed by a rifle, this isn't just AR-15. How many people are killed by rifles in total? This is including hunting rifles, bolt-action rifles, semi-automatic rifles. The number falls somewhere annually between 300 and 400 people out of 320 million. That's including mass shootings, that's including school shootings, that's including every type of rifle there is in every murder situation that there is. It's 300 to 400 annually. Now, you compare that number to the number of people that are killed by knives, just knives alone. People killed by knives is in the many thousands. People killed by blunt objects, not as high as knives, but still higher than when you combine the two, knives and blunt objects, it's much, much higher than those that are killed by rifles. So for the leftists to come out and say, oh, it feels really good because they feel like they're doing something, they're going to do something to stop these shootings, but you're talking about a statistically insignificant variable or number here. So then let's look. I mean, if we evaluate this from a Norwegian perspective, this is where it gets probably a little bit more interesting for you guys. You guys might be aware that Norway is actually one of the most well-armed countries in the world per capita. AR-15s aren't banned here, right? And per capita, whether you're looking at Western, so let's say look at Western world, it's.
You have to be a member of a shooting club, right?
Yes, you do have. Right? Yeah, I'm getting there. You do have strict regulations. There's no doubt about it. And there's an application process, I think, for each weapon you own, and the government can come to your door whenever they want and inspect your safe. So you really sacrifice a level of privacy there. I mean, there's a lot of, in my views, a lot of very invasive and ridiculous regulations. So, but the point is looking at this in corollary way, in the way that you are one of the most well-armed countries in the Western world, but you also have one of the lowest crime rates in the world and lowest murder rates in the world, right? So again, here we get back to guns in the hands of civilians does not translate to higher murder or higher mass shootings or higher what have you. And then, so the next argument for a leftist to make against me in that would say, well, Norway also has very strict regulations. You just talked about that. Well, sure, I did. Right? But what good were those regulations when Anders Behring Breivik set off a car bomb in Oslo and then went and slaughtered over 60 children on an island? Regulations didn't do much to stop them. That single mass shooting incident alone, because Norway has about 5.2 million people, that put Norway at the top of the list for gun deaths per capita in mass shootings, and number 5 in the world for mass shooting frequency per capita. So it's easy to take that number and say, oh, look how bad it is. But then if you look at it from the bigger picture, you stand out and look at the bigger picture. Norway's a very safe country, very low crime rate compared to most other Western countries, right? And so it's getting past this sensationalism of cherry-picking data and saying, look at this, this is why we must take action. And so it sounds nice, it's like, oh yeah, let's have a common sense debate about gun control. But I just don't see the common sense part happening with Democrats calling for a ban on AR-15 when AR-15, as far as gun murders go in the United States, are statistically insignificant, statistically inconsequential. I don't see common sense happening there. Really, if you're going to start talking about wanting to save lives, whether it's children or people in general, then you'd have to more logically have to consider knives or even handguns. You have to start considering handguns. And the reason you particularly don't want to consider handguns is because when you start looking at where these handgun killings are happening, they're happening in cities like Detroit and Chicago and Baltimore and New Orleans, where they already have heavy restrictions on handguns. You couldn't possibly come up with more restrictions on handguns. Then you look at Chicago, and their handgun crime recently and murders recently dropped a bit. But wouldn't you know it, that drop happened after they opened up concealed carry again, when they legalized concealed carry again. So you're letting law-abiding citizens finally carry a means of defense. Because when you ban guns and you do this, all you're really doing is disarming law-abiding people. Right? We're going to ban guns and that way we'll stop shootings. And then the response is, well, why stop there? Let's make murder illegal too.